afternoon. Thank you. We're going to start our public hearings on LD 1401 and LD 1380. First, we're going to start with introductions, starting with my right.
Good afternoon, I'm Rick Long. I represent District 145 and the rest of the people state.
Good afternoon, my name is Representative Catherine Nadeau. I represent District 78, which is Winslow and a portion of Benton.
Good afternoon, my name is Mike Timmons. I represent District 45, which is Cumberland and a small part of Dryden.
And I'm Kimberly Rosen, Senate District 8. My district goes from Castine all the way up to Lincoln, and I live in Bucksport.
Good afternoon, I'm Lori Fowler. I represent District 80, which is Bassboro, Windsor, Somerville, Hibbert School, and a little piece of Augusta.
Good afternoon, I'm Michael LaJoy. I represent District 58, which is part of Lewiston.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Dustin Schmidt. I represent House District 15, part of the City of South Park.
Good afternoon, Karen Garish, District 20, the towns of Lebanon, Acton, and Shapley.
Good afternoon, I'm representing Jim Babbitt. In the absence of Senator Brzezowski, I'll keep it simple. I represent Hamden and Newburgh.
Jane, do you have anything for us before we start?
Well, I think our first bill is the Transportation Committee's request to us about LD 1320, and they have a bill, LD 1320, that has a lot of motor vehicle law issues in it. In it are also some questions about THC, blood levels, and preliminary breath tests and the process of establishing a blood level for THC. There's a purple sheet that I did up for you, and it outlines what the different questions are. And then you have the packet from the Transportation Committee. There really are two issues. One is related to THC level, and the other is the preliminary breath test. My understanding is that these are issues that have for years been handled by this committee. And we do have some time next week when we could address these issues. And so I wondered what you would like to do.
Representative Powell?
Thank you. I'm thinking that it might be a good thing for us to send a letter to Transportation asking them to remove from the bill that's in front of them 136 that's on the purple paper and have that sent to us. There's a question about number 3, whether or not that should be with them or stay here for review. I think it is something that's typically in this committee to review from what I'm hearing from the department. So I would suggest that we keep those with us and that they be able to withdraw it from the bill that's in front of them would be my request, or I think our request, and that we work on it along with the bills that we're dealing with today. Same thing we kind of got on here.
Representative Schmidt?
Thank you, Madam Chair. When it comes back to us, is it going to have its own public hearing? I just feel like it's so odd to have this in an omnibus package. I agree that we should take it out, but it should be a standalone bill that has the typical process of a public hearing and its own work session.
Representative Powell?
I would agree with you, Representative Schmidt. I think it is something that we probably would want to have a public hearing on. It's information that would be new to a lot of members on the committee, including myself. And that having a public hearing and hearing that information, even though that had one in front of Transportation, that it would be for us to move forward, we would want to have a public hearing on it. And I see us potentially either having our own bill go out on it or possibly encompass in one of the bills that's in front of us.
Representative Long?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Being on the committee for a while, we've worked many of these bills here, so I think it's appropriate. With the lack of experience working these bills, I think it would be have a public hearing so everybody can be brought up to speed, whether it's interlocking devices, whatnot. We've worked those through, so just bringing the history forward is the very helpful. I would go along with
So yes, that was a motion.
that.
All those in favor?
So when would you like to put this next week?
Monday?
Nope, Monday's a
Oh,
holiday.
it's a holiday.
We'll be here.
Tuesday?
Tuesday works. If that works for members. Thank you, Ken.
We're going to be working these bills together today, 1380 and 1401. And we're going to hear from the sponsors first of each bill, then the co-sponsors, and then we have a list of people that we'll be hearing from. And you will have 3 minutes to give your testimony on whichever bill you want to give your testimony on. So we're going to start with 1380. And the sponsor of that bill is Representative Russell.
It was a much smaller room 4 years ago. So before I start, I'm going to present my bill, obviously, but you'll hear we are working toward similar language, and I think we're in a pretty good space on that, and I certainly co-sponsored LD 1401 as well. Senator Rosen, Representative Fowle, and distinguished members of the esteemed Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee, thank you for the opportunity to submit testimony to you regarding LD 1380 and Act to Tax and Regulate Marijuana. My name is Diane Russell. I represent District 39 in the main house, representing the good people of Monterey Hill, downtown Portland, and the beautiful Casco Bay Islands. Let me ask you a simple question. If I were standing before you today with a bill to ban the sale of alcohol, how would you vote? Would you vote yes? To bring prohibition of alcohol back? Or would you vote no? And it's a simple question. And it really is the question I think that Representative Dion and I are asking. Let me give you a quote from John D. Rockefeller, who was very supportive of prohibition. Here's what he wrote in a 1932 letter. Quote, "When prohibition was introduced, I hoped that it would be widely supported by public opinion, and the day would soon come when the evil effects of alcohol would be recognized. I have slowly and reluctantly come to believe that this has not been the result. Instead, drinking has generally increased, the speakeasy has replaced the saloon, a vast army of lawbreakers has appeared, many of our best citizens have openly ignored prohibition, respect for the law has been greatly lessened, and crime has increased to a level never seen before." Largely because that is very similar to what has happened in marijuana prohibition, a majority of Mainers now agree that the current policy of prohibition regarding marijuana should be replaced with a system of regulation similar to alcohol. Representative Dion and I both believe that as a legislature, we should get ahead of this issue, craft a responsible policy, and let the people of Maine decide the question of whether or not to end prohibition. This is a refrain, this last part, that I have said for years. But next year, there will be one referendum, if not two, to contend with. The Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee has been dealing with the aftermath of casinos who use the Citizens Initiative process to write the regulations by which they are now governed. Lawmakers who opposed casinos were not willing to get ahead of that issue, and we have now been playing catch-up ever since. We can learn from history, both the rise and the fall of the national prohibition movement, as well as the casino industry right here at home. Or we can all be here next year with not one, but maybe two citizens initiatives before us, wondering what we are going to do if both initiatives pass. You will hear a host of reasons why we should not get ahead of this issue. Some will tell you that this is in fact not inevitable, despite the fact that Colorado, Washington State, Alaska, Oregon, and Washington, D.C. have all legalized adult use at the ballot box. You will also hear that Maine has not one, but 2 competing referenda on the subject. Let me outline arguments that I have heard against legalization and walk you through the science that debunks many of those arguments that they have made or will be currently made today. Before I do that, I want to outline why I'm standing here though. For the 3rd time before this committee. When you propose something like this, you really have to understand at the core of who you are, why you are doing this. Some of my closest friends say, I love what you do, but legalization is just not my issue. It's not easy to be told day in and day out that you're irrational, that you are irresponsible, or that you are in bed with big business. The thing is that this cause is just too great. It is too important not to do it the justice that it deserves. We are one of the whitest states in the Union, and yet African Americans are arrested twice as often as those of us who are white. If you live in York County and you happen to be African American, the numbers are even more staggering. These aren't just statistics. Representative Dion and I worked together to aid a young college student who had been arrested for having his medical marijuana in his car, even though he had his recommendation with him. His mother called me desperate for help. I learned later that the kid happened to be African American. He was driving through a wealthy suburban neighborhood. Just before they were pulled over, he looked at his friend as the cop car drove by and said, "Watch out, we're probably going to get pulled over." If it were not for Representative Dion, he would still have a charge next to his name for life, meaning that any time he was pulled over, law enforcement would see that he had been charged for possession. Would this color future interactions with law enforcement? Who knows? But I bet your gut can tell you the answer. Further, a marijuana possession will would preclude an individual for life from receiving Pell Grants, student loans, and even some federal public assistance. How are we going to help people lift themselves out of poverty if they can't access the very education that will then set them on a better course? By denying that education, we are forcing them either into low-wage jobs, or still, if they cannot make ends meet, a life of crime, all because of a marijuana possession charge. If you couple these issues, it means that African Americans are being uniquely denied access to higher education funds, further isolating them from the American dream. To that end, we must also think about how African Americans can have a pathway into the legal market. If Joe Kennedy can make millions off the bootleg industry only to become one of the wealthiest members of American society, surely some of these African American kids that have been disproportionately burdened by prohibition, we have the opportunity to climb the economic ladder when we do move past prohibition. It cannot, if Maine moves forward with any prohibition, it cannot just be the white community that benefits from the market. Lastly, this committee deals with a lot of gun policy. Personally, I find the gun debate less than enlightening. I grew up hunting and happened to shoot rather on point. But I also don't know anybody who goes hunting with someone who is trigger happy. It's just plain gun. Several years back, I lived in Philadelphia. I was a 22-year-old sheltered kid from western Maine when at about 1:30 in the morning, I dove off my bed and away from the window. 5 shots rang out, one after another. After they stopped, I looked down to see a guy jumping into a convertible with his friends and then tearing off the street. There's nothing to check your temper like a drive-by shooting, let me tell you. For countless people in the inner cities, gun violence is a way of life. It's what's driving some of the overall gun debate. Obviously, we are all mystified about how to deal with these mass shootings, but when it comes to inner city gun violence, we can fix that by ending the war on drugs. Most gun violence is related to gang violence, much like we saw in Texas earlier this week. That gang violence stems from the drug trade. If we can take the money out of the gangs, out of the drug dealers, and out of the drug cartels, I think we will see the number of gun-related deaths drop dramatically. And maybe we can find a more rational path on a debate that has spun into an ideological quagmire for both sides unnecessarily. This is a righteous and just cause, and one that I will see through to its end. We must do it right. We must be rational about our regulatory approach. Make no mistake about my resolve. or the movement sweeping this nation, and in particular, this state. Prohibition began in Portland, Maine. I intend to see it end there as well. Now let me dive into some specifics. Before I dive into the specific testimony about the bill, let me walk you through where we are in working toward a unified bill. First, Representative Dion and I are in 95% agreement about what is already written into our bills. Representative Dion's is based largely on an earlier draft that I had written, and the changes reflect some of the concerns in the direction that the dispensary operators and that Mark Dion would like to see happen. My bill has expanded that bill significantly to include regulations from Colorado, as I will outline below. The key differences center on a few key policy choices. Automatic licenses. My bill crafts a fair path for caregivers and dispensaries to the emerging market without picking sides or favoring either side of the market. The dispensaries have made it clear that they would like automatic licenses, and they will make their case for that before you. Caregivers are concerned about preferential treatment that inherently implies that they understandably want to be treated equitably under the law. I agree with them. The question of 2015 versus 2016, some would like to see this move forward in 2015. I believe the broadest number of voters should be making a decision of this magnitude. Since there's a presidential election coming right up, it only makes sense to send this to the ballot in 2016, which my bill does. Retail stores. My bill sets the retail stores by population in a similar manner to what we already do under liquor licenses. We have come to agree that a system based on county population, coupled with some caveats for counties with large geographies, which might work better than what I have in my current bill. We agree that there shouldn't be retail stores on every street corner. The question is, how do we ensure that supply meets the demand, considering population and geographic dispersity? So let me dive into some of the things that we're going to talk about today with some of the folks that are going to come behind me. First, I want to talk about addiction. When examining a public policy or the repeal of a public policy, we should carefully review the rationale for the policy in the first place. Most of the arguments for prohibition all lead back to society's fear of individuals becoming addicted to a substance. If the debate is really about addiction and the prospective outcomes inherent, then let's have that conversation. In 1914, it may surprise you that the U.S. had a 1.3% addiction rate. In 1971, when Nixon launched the war on drugs, the U.S. had a 1.3% addiction rate. In 2010, the U.S. had a 1.3% addiction rate. The stunning thing about addiction is that it is a constant, despite the war on drugs. Instead of continuing to invest resources into the prohibition side, wouldn't it make more sense to invest resources in the addiction treatment side of the equation? This bill does that. It funds addiction treatment while also investing in training so more officers can become drug recognition experts, reducing the number of impaired drivers on the road. In your testimony, you can actually see at what level different drugs will get you addicted, and you can see that marijuana is fairly low on that account. Let me talk a little bit about youth access. Law enforcement officers and substance abuse counselors extensively suggest there will be a noticeable impact on youth consumption were there to be a fully legalized policy. Included within are studies demonstrating that in medical marijuana states, youth consumption has either remained stable or declined outright. You may want to look at one of the articles that I gave you from Reason Magazine, the headline of which says something to the effect of teens stubbornly, despite legalization, Colorado teenagers stubbornly refuse to smoke more pot, which is in direct conflict with what you're going to hear today. Teen Colorado use, let me talk about this. While it might disappoint the anti-regulation advocates, the evidence in Colorado does not show an increase in teen consumption. The Colorado Department of Public Health data shows that from 2011 to 2013, the rate of current marijuana use among Colorado high school students has actually decreased from 22% to 20%. During the same time, the CDC data shows that national teen marijuana usage has remained virtually unchanged. The CDPHC survey also shows that lifetime use among high school students has declined from 39% to 37% during the same 2 years. As we are going to hear from others about how teen marijuana use and youth use will increase, I want you to be very clear that the evidence does not bear that out. There will be a lot of folks that talk about the need for a scientific debate. I'm showing you the science, and it's in direct conflict with the speculation that you're going to hear. Let's talk about the issue of IQ. You've all heard that IQ percentage drops. There has been and continues to be an assertion that young people will see an 8-point drop in IQ if they use marijuana as young people. This information was based on a 2012 Duke University study of 38 individuals that has been heavily criticized. According to the Washington Post, a follow-up study published in the same journal less than a year later said, quote, although it would be too strong to say that the results have been discredited, the methodology is flawed and the causal inference drawn from the results premature. They further report, now a new study out from the University College of London provides even stronger evidence that the Duke findings were flawed. The study draws on considerably larger samples of adolescents than the Duke research, 2,612 children born in the Bristol area of the UK. It goes on to talk about it, but essentially they make the case in there that alcohol and other contributing factors may be part of the reason that people go on to have that IQ drop. That is not, you cannot just say that it's about marijuana use. And that is a statistic that has been sent out in the media consistently. So let's talk about the real issues of youth access. I want to be very clear that no one working toward a rational approach to marijuana regulation disagrees that young people should not be consuming marijuana, any more than we believe that they should be consuming alcohol or tobacco. We simply believe that the current system of prohibition is having a deleterious effect on our ability to reduce access to young people, and that regulation would be a far better approach. The New York Times editorial put it best. Marijuana's negative health effects are arguments for the same strong regulation that has been effective in curbing abuse of legal substances. Science and government have learned a great deal, for example, about how to keep alcohol out of the hands of minders. Mandatory underage drinking laws and effective marketing campaigns have reduced underage alcohol use to 24.8% in 2011, which is compared to 33.4% in 1991. Cigarette use among high school students is at its lowest point ever, largely thanks to tobacco taxes and growing municipal smoking limits. There's already some early evidence that regulation would also help combat teen marijuana use, which fell after Colorado began broadly regulating medical marijuana in 2010. You're also going to hear that this ain't your grandma's pot. That is true. It's not the same pot that was in the 60s and 70s. It is precisely why we should be regulating the market. Prior to Prohibition, bottles were labeled with X's, and by all accounts, the alcohol produced was terrible. One of the benefits that came from Prohibition is that following repeal, the standards for production were much stricter, as were labeling requirements. The moonshine you can buy at the grocery store now is probably a lot better handled than when it was allegedly made in a Sunday River still that our family continues to deny my grandfather had anything to do with. So don't ask. Through proper regulation, we can manage the content, the potency, and the labeling in a manner that addresses the issue more adequately. We spoke about impaired driving. I would like to say I have put in a bill. I'm waiting for the presiding officers to allow me to circulate a ballot to create a vehicle to address the impaired driving issue. I don't believe that either of these bills is the right mechanism to do it, and I'll explain to you why. These bills, if passed, will be predicated on the idea that they will go into effect in 2016, or after the voters vote on it. I would hope that the state would not want to address impaired driving and wait until 2016 for the results to occur. I do think it would be a better use of our time to allow the second bill, the after deadline bill that I've moved forward to use as a vehicle, and I think then the state can actually do it sooner rather than waiting. As we have already heard earlier today, while it is already illegal to drive while impaired with marijuana, and while we also have drug recognition experts, we thoroughly agree that the prosecution of impaired driving is difficult without the appropriate metrics. I remain committed to working with the committee as well as transportation to find a path forward. However, I would say that within this bill, I set aside funds to fund training so we can actually increase the number of drug recognition experts across the state. Let's talk about traffic fatalities, which is why we care about impaired driving. Opponents argue that ending prohibition will actually increase traffic fatalities. Again, the evidence does not bear this out. An October 2012 study analyzed traffic data for states where medical marijuana had been legalized. The data was analyzed both before and after the laws were passed and compared against traffic fatalities in neighboring states. The study concluded that for people between the ages of 5 and 34 in the first full year of medical marijuana laws coming into effect, legalization is actually associated with an 8 to 11% decrease in traffic fatalities. And that age range is a very important age range because that's where you see the majority of fatalities coming Further, traffic fatalities fell 3% in the first year of legal marijuana sales in Colorado for adult use. So let's talk about edibles for a second. There is no question that Colorado was taken off guard by legalization, and the most notable problem that resulted pertained to edibles, things like brownies, cookies, candies, etc. In response, state regulators designed standards for dosing, packaging, and labeling that have been working. This is a classic example of how things can go wrong if you don't have a thoughtful, deliberative approach ahead of time to anticipate challenges. I modeled the edibles section of the bill after Colorado's late but successful regulations around edibles. Concentrates. By 2019, it is estimated that a full 35% of the market will be in concentrates. There are some real benefits to concentrates as well as some real challenges, which is why it is essential we flesh out the section in great detail. Thankfully, Colorado has done some good research in this area and enacted some strong guidelines which are already included in this bill. There are some great benefits to concentrates. They're easier to work with when creating non-smokable options. Vaping has taken off, which is a vaporizer as opposed to having secondhand smoke, which is the real issue. One of the fundamental issues around smoking is that in addition to the carcinogens that are placed in there, happens to be related to the combustion. Setting the dosage is also significantly easier with concentrates. But there are some challenges with concentrates. And when I talk about concentrates, I'm talking about little oils. Some of the challenges relate to its extraction and its dosing. There is no question that butane extraction can be quite volatile if done improperly. Further, it is essential that the butane be allowed to completely burn off prior to ingestion. You don't want to have alcohol in butane specifically. Colorado set up very clear standards for concentrate extraction, requiring it to be done with experts in a commercial laboratory. Those standards are codified in this bill, which